I'm Dr. Dania Arayssi. I'm a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, and I support the team effort this year on the S7 initiative, focusing on the regional integrations among Central Asian states. I'm also an assistant professor at Georgetown University and George Washington University. And today we are diving into one of the most urgent and underreported challenges facing the Central Asia region, the crisis of water. My guest today is Alexander Thompson, a freelancer journalist in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, who covers Central Asia for English language outlets, including EurasiaNet and other publications. Thanks, Alexander, for being with us today.
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So to start the conversation today, I have some opening questions. Alex, for listeners who may not follow Central Asia closely, or they're not very much sure and information about the politics and the situation there when it comes to water, can you paint a picture of what the water situation looks like on the ground right now in Central Asia?
Well, since the Soviets transformed water in Central Asia in the 30s and then again in the 50s and 60s, basically what happens is the vast majority of the water resources are generated in upstream countries in the mountains, the Pamirs and the Tian Shan, the countries of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. So they generate about 70%, 75% of the water, but most of the water is used downstream in the countries of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. And there's one major basin in most of southern Central Asia, which is the Aral Sea basin. Most people probably are familiar with the Aral Sea because it has all but disappeared. It's now two small, it's two small lakes now. But it disappeared because that water was diverted from two major rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, to expand cotton cultivation, especially in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. So you have a lot of water generated in the mountains, and then it flows through these rivers downstream to these very arid countries where it's used principally for cotton cultivation, but the countries downstream have also been shifting a lot more to wheat and things like that. I will note that the situation is a lot different in Kazakhstan, which I think we mentioned a lot in the report. They're part of several different basins, including rivers that flow from Russia, rivers that flow from China. So the issues are a little different in Kazakhstan, especially northern Kazakhstan. But I think the big issue here is the Aral Sea Basin, which is those two rivers I mentioned, and a lot of agricultural cultivation in very, very arid areas where it barely rains at all.
Thank you so much. That's helpful. I want to shift more to discuss more the title of the report. So the report title is really When Water Becomes Glue. What does that phrase mean to you? And why do you think it was helpful to frame the report around that title?
Well, the countries of Central Asia have to work together. They have to cooperate on water because of the geography and the infrastructure left behind by the Soviets. As I mentioned, most of the water is generated in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And those two countries both have major reservoirs. This can sound sort of boring and technical, but the Taktugul reservoir in Kyrgyzstan and the Nurek reservoir in Tajikistan are massive reservoirs. So those two countries basically regulate the flow of water through the region's two large rivers, through those reservoirs. And they have to, because reservoirs and water regulation works much better at higher elevations downstream. So during periods of increased tensions in the region, downstream countries tried to regulate water. They tried to build downstream reservoirs, but those are less effective because they often wash out too quickly and because they're too shallow. So basically, the downstream countries have to work with the upstream countries to coordinate when the water flows through the reservoirs. Because for agriculture to work, the natural flow of the rivers isn't as effective as when the upstream countries regulate it. So the downstream countries have to talk to the upstream countries about when the water is released, how much water is released, and that requires cooperation. So in a way, it's glue. And another thing about glue is sometimes you can't control, sometimes the consequences of glue, things get a little sticky, and that certainly happened in Central Asia, because they don't always like working together, but they have to.
But they have to. Yeah, that's definitely helpful. We hear a lot of water crisis happening in different part of the world. So we hear about water crisis happening in America, Southwest, in the Middle East, but we don't hear a lot about what's going on in Central Asia. Why do you think Central Asia is not getting the same attention when it comes to the water crisis? Like why the attention is being focused? So what do you think is really the factor here?
Well, I think it's definitely getting a lot of attention. It's unavoidable in Central Asia. In Kyrgyzstan earlier, because of the low water level in the Toktogul Reservoir, there were restrictions on when public buildings could be open. There were, at mosques all across Uzbekistan, there were prayers for rain late last year. So it's definitely top of mind in Central Asia, but I think the reason why people in the United States or in Europe might not hear so much about it is because the region is far from the United States and is far from Europe, and has long not been top of mind for policymakers in those two places for various reasons. And so I think the lack of attention to the water issues in Central Asia is for the same reasons that there's a lack of attention to lots of different things in Central Asia. But as you mentioned, policymakers in the U.S. are probably a little more concentrated on the Colorado River issues, and in Europe, they've got their own glaciers to worry about. So, right. Lots of water's a problem in a lot of different places, and Central Asia is certainly no exception.
Yeah, definitely. So if we want to go back and kind of try to unpack together the root causes of the water crisis that you mentioned in Central Asia, the report argues that climate change is an accelerant, not really the root cause of what is going on in Central Asia. Can you walk us through the Soviet Union decision that created that mess? So how really the Soviet Union kind of contributed in one way or another to that mess that we are right now facing?
So the arid regions of Central Asia have always been irrigated from these mountain rivers, dating pre-Tsarist colonization of the region. The mass diversion of water started actually under the Tsars pre-revolution, but it really accelerated under the Soviets. And what they did is they diverted, as I mentioned, there are two major rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya in the Aral Sea Basin. They diverted, estimates vary, it depends each year, but now in 2024, about 1 cubic kilometer of water reached the Aral Sea, what remains of it from both of those rivers. So that's a diversion of somewhere over 95% of the water. So they diverted more than 95% of the water to agriculture, specifically to cotton. And they did this by building large dams and reservoirs and canals, most famously the Great Fergana Canal, which was built in 45 days in the 1930s. And it was sort of famous in Central Asia because it was sort of the workers coming together and contributing to the greatness of the building the Soviet Union. But in the 1950s and 60s, that accelerated a lot. It got a lot more scientific. The canals got bigger and more expansive. For instance, the Karakum Canal. The only reason there's agriculture in Turkmenistan is because the Soviets built what is one of the largest, if not the largest, water diversions, man-made water diversions in the world, which is why arid Turkmenistan has any water at all, is because of that Soviet canal. So what they did is, to get that irrigation water through the summer, they need the upstream republics to release water during the summer through their dams. So this creates, because the summer is the key growing period, and there's no rain at all in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and southern Kazakhstan during those points. So they need the upstream countries to release the water in the summer. But there's an issue because, and this is the heart of the many factored crisis of water in Central Asia. The upstream countries don't. It's not in their interest to release the water during the summer. They want to release the water during the winter, and that's because when they release water, they're also generating hydroelectricity, which is basically all the generation in Tajikistan and is about 75% of the generation in Kyrgyzstan. So they want to release the water in the winter, but the downstream countries want them to release it in the summer. So there you have a fundamental clash. And that's really the heart of the problem. So the Soviets solved this by simply instructing Tashkent and Almaty at the time to send Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan energy during the winter. So the Soviets could solve this problem just by saying, you're going to release the water during the summer, and we'll send you free energy because Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are rich in hydrocarbons. We'll send you energy in the winter. But as soon as the Soviet Union falls apart, that deal starts to fall apart. Pre-Soviet collapse, about 75% of the water, I'm talking just about Kyrgyzstan here, 75% of the water is released during the summer, 25% the rest of the year. As soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, it flips to about 55 during the winter, 45 during the summer. Because Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, once they were in a market economy and were independent, said, you know, we're not so thrilled about giving you free oil and gas when we can get we can get any price at all on the international market. So in the 90s, there's sort of this kind of, the agreements are signed, most importantly, the Almaty Treaty, which preserves the Soviet allocation of water, and that agreement is still the basis for water distribution today. So there is some cooperation. In the late 90s, you get the Sirdarya Agreement, which combines water and energy. So it sort of looks like they're moving in the right direction. And then at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, Uzbek dictator Islam Karimov takes a very isolationist stance, and everything sort of falls apart. And you have the next 16, 17, 18 years of incredibly high tensions about who controls the water, who can build infrastructure, what infrastructure should be built, and most importantly, when the water is released. So those are the tensions. And as you mentioned, increased variability, less predictability from climate change is now adding into that dynamic, right? As well as Afghanistan's canal and growing water demand. So those are the three stressors that are being put on this already sort of tense balance between upstream and downstream.
This is a very helpful way to answer the question, because you help us understand not only why climate change is an accelerant, but also the Soviet decision toward that issue. So I think connecting these two questions together was very helpful. Thank you. I do want to discuss more about some statistics that were mentioned in the report that I think are alarming right now. So the report mentioned that water availability per person has really dropped from 8,400 cubic meters to 2,500 over 40 years. If hypothetical, not in a more realistic situation, how does that mean? What does that really mean for ordinary people who lives in the region?
So by 2050, that could fall again to about 1,700 cubic meters per person. The main effect that statistic could have would be on agriculture. So domestic consumption in cities is actually mostly is a lot with groundwater, so it's a little different, but agriculture would be the main impact of that statistic, especially cotton and wheat, especially in Uzbekistan and especially in Turkmenistan. And though a pretty small fraction at this point of the populations of those countries work in agriculture, not like Europe or the United States where it's 1-2%, but you're still looking at a fair number, but definitely not a majority anymore as it was several decades ago. But the impact will really be on agriculture, which is key to rural regions. And so the poorest people in these countries, some of the poorest people in these countries are most reliant on agriculture. And if you see increased drought or increased flooding, which also devastates crops, it will be farmers and other people in rural areas who suffer, which could cause more migration to cities, which could cause more labor migration, and has all sorts of knock-on effects. Um, yes, that's the water per capita number would mostly impact agriculture.
And speaking about like the water per capita and how it can impact people and agriculture, the report mentioned that over 50 people died in the clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in 2021 over conflicts related to water disputes between these two economies. I guess my question here is more how close is the region to a more serious conflict, particularly water, if this is really a concern?
So the border clashes, water definitely played a contributing factor. So Central Asia's borders often run along the border between mountains and foothills and flatland, right? So the
Right.
Fergana Valley, you have Tajik and Uzbek control over the flattest, most central areas, and Kyrgyzstan has control over the more mountainous areas. And so where water gets involved with that is those are the areas, those foothill areas right out of the mountains are often where you have a lot of reservoirs.
Right.
And reservoirs are very important to local agriculture, so they happen to fall often on those boundaries, and their control was contested in a lot of cases. Most notably, what the Uzbeks who now control it called the Andijan Reservoir, for example. But I will say on those border clashes, we're still not exactly sure what started that conflict. So I just want to put that caveat there. There was a lot going on between Rakhmon and the Kyrgyz, but water definitely played a part, and water's played a part in almost all of the conflicts that have taken place in Central Asia. The potential for conflict now, fortunately, is much lower. We're seeing much increased cooperation in Central Asia since the death of Islam Karimov, the Uzbek dictator, in 2016. His successor, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, has moved towards water collaboration. I just talked to the head of the scientific directorate of the Coordinating Commission for Water in Central Asia. Collaboration has advanced by leaps and bounds since 2016. So the potential for water conflict has gone down substantially. And they're even sharing the financing and planning of certain big water projects that used to cause lots of conflict, lots of tension between those countries. So the potential for conflict has definitely gone down, but the root causes of conflict remain. And if there were serious water threats to water, those could reemerge. And I think a lot of experts, a lot of academics who study this would say that they would prefer to see stronger regional organizations that are given more powers by the governments. But in talking to people, that prospect would be very difficult to achieve. So basically, I would say the potential for conflict over water has gone down substantially, which is great. Many of the root causes are still there. If there was a change in personalities or a serious change in water supply, and there's still work that could be done towards giving regional cooperation a more institutionalized form, a better defined form.
I want to ask a question. By the way, you answered a question that I had about the death of the former Uzbekistan leader, Karimov. So thank you so much for this. But I have a follow-up question on something you mentioned. Do you see a difficulty or challenges in the capacity of the government to empower institutionalized organizations to actually take the lead? And if yes, why and how? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. It wasn't written, but it's something I'm curious to hear what you think about it.
The Interstate Commission for Water Coordination is the international body, and it was founded, I worry that I get the date wrong, I want to say 1993, but in the early 90s. Okay. And so it's the main body, but it doesn't look like the European Union where they have powers. It's basically a platform for the governments themselves to come together. As a group of five to look at how they're going to direct water use in Central Asia. And it's actually a step below the International Fund to Save the Aral Sea, which is the umbrella organization for water in and to some extent the environment in the Aral Sea Basin. Then you have the Interstate Coordination Commission, which is a platform for these countries to come together. And then finally, you have basin organizations. So lots of little layers of this. Basin organizations that they control some of the major infrastructure in the basins. So I think that the roadblocks to strengthening those organizations are that the governments themselves would prefer not to give up sovereignty over water. So I think that what I have been told is the most likely path forward for this would be a strengthened interstate commission, but still with a heavy role for the governments. Better coordination between the governments, probably, rather than the governments giving up power entirely. So more of a, the Europeans will immediately know I'm getting this wrong. I want to say European Council rather than European Commission. So more of an interministerial, tighter cooperation interministerially rather than giving power to an institution. So yes, but I would say that things are definitely moving in the right direction. And you're seeing much more cooperation, much more openness compared to pre-2016, as you mentioned, under Uzbek President Islam Karimov, when troops were being deployed, blockades, anything that could have been used to build a dam was blockaded by Uzbekistan, couldn't get it in Tajikistan. Tensions were super high just a decade ago, and now they're really moving in the right direction. And one more thing I'll add, and I've been talking too much on this, another really positive development is the joint ownership of the Kambar Atta 1 hydropower project. So even though it's fully located in Kyrgyzstan, because it would have an effect on Uzbekistan and on Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan dropped its opposition to this project, and instead all three countries are now equally sharing in the financing and planning of that massive dam, because it'll affect all of them. And that, a lot of people think, is a blueprint for joint ownership and operation of water resources that affect the entire region, even if they are located in one country. Although other critics would say, mega projects have their own problems, and I want to acknowledge that. But anyways, so a couple of templates for cooperation that are developing and definitely moving in the right direction in the region.
Thank you. Thank you. I do want to shift some gears and talk about emerging threats to this conversation. I want to talk about Afghanistan and what they're doing right now in the Ouch-Tepa Canal. Taliban is building this massive irrigation project that we are all aware of. My question is, what's at the stake for this for the downstream countries, given what the Taliban in Afghanistan are really doing right now with their canal?
So I've mentioned the Amu Darya, which is a large river that runs from the mountains of Tajikistan through several tributaries, through all the way to the former Aral Sea, mostly through Uzbekistan, but that river also supplies almost all of the water to Turkmenistan as well. So this is a very important river to Uzbekistan and to Turkmenistan. However, much of the water in that river is generated in the mountains of Afghanistan, along the border with Tajikistan. Okay, so if you apply international principles, and Afghanistan is not a signatory of any UN Convention on Water, so that's already, you see where this is getting complicated.
Right.
But much of the water, again, I want to be careful of the figure here, but a fair portion of the water, maybe about 1/3, but I'd be careful with that statistic, is generated in the Afghan mountains and then flows through the Panj River to the Amu Darya, where it flows out to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. So pretty much everyone agrees that Uzbekistan has the right, that Afghanistan has the right to use this water. The snow fell, the glaciers melted, the rain fell in their territory. So what they're doing is building the Ouch-Tepa Canal, which will divert water from the Amu Darya after it flows out of Tajikistan. So this doesn't affect Tajikistan. It does affect Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan.
Right.
It is, I've heard it described by one diplomat in the region as, you know, a swimming pool in the sand for a couple hundred kilometers. It is, the construction quality is not, by most accounts, very impressive. From the photos we've seen, there was even an accident a few years ago where they managed to create an artificial lake by accident, and all of that water evaporated. So there are serious concerns about the quality of this canal, but the point is that Afghanistan wants to run it from the Uzbek border from about the Uzbek border to Mazar al-Sharif, because the high population, high poverty, and low yield for agriculture. So they see this as a guarantee of prosperity for their heavily populated, heavily agricultural, their heavily populated northern provinces. So that's why they want to build the canal. But I've already mentioned some of the issues. The construction is a real question, whether this will even help agriculture at all, based on the design of the canal. The other problem for the other countries is just how much water it'll take. And estimates for how much water will be diverted by the Kush-Tepe Canal range all over the place. You read one analysis, you'll get the other. It could range anywhere from, and it depends on the year too, but anywhere from 10 to a third of the water, that somewhere in there, could be diverted by this canal, which would be really major for Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And the problem is there has not been super great dialogue with the Afghans, with the Taliban government, about this canal. And that has improved as well. I think that has improved as well, but the Taliban are very, they are insistent that this will be built. And I just heard a French journalist got out there from Radio France Internationale, and they were working on it as fast as they could. So sort of fait accompli at this point. And that's definitely something that especially Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan will have to deal with.
Right. I do want to shift some gears and talk a little bit about Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, where we're reading the news, we're reading the analysis, really Kazakhstan is working to become the tech hub, if you want to say, in Central Asia. They're building data centers. They have a new Ministry of AI. They are planning an entire new kind of city called Alatu, if I'm not mistaken. And so a single larger center that can use up to 5 million gallons of water. And so they're investing so much in their system. I guess my question is, how does that water fit and these big projects fit with the crisis that the region is going through? And what are the challenges, the concerns, and whether the Kazakhs are really aware of what's going on?
So data centers definitely take a lot of water. There are questions in the United States and in Europe about exactly how much water AI costs. No one's really sure, but we know that it's a lot. So Kazakhstan, as I mentioned, they are not, everything we've been talking about so far has really been about the Aral Sea Basin, and southern Kazakhstan is definitely absolutely impacted by that. But northern Kazakhstan has different river systems. For instance, north of Almaty, you have Lake Balkhash, and that's the Ili River, which flows from China, which has a whole different series of issues. But water projections in northern Kazakhstan range, and so adding on to a growing population, adding on to all these other stressors from climate change could be AI, and we're really not sure how much that will consume in terms of water. So it's definitely something to watch out for, and one does question how much, if it's worth it.
Right, exactly, totally. I want to talk with you about the nuclear energy. We're hearing a lot of news about nuclear energy being considered or positioned as a solution to the power deficit that the region is going through. But we also know that nuclear plants consumes a lot amount of water for cooling them down. And so I'm curious if the region are kind of trying to trade one problem for another, and how nuclear energy is being framed and the conversation is going on in the region.
Well, nuclear energy will happen. Uzbekistan will have several reactors, or at least they're planning to through Rosatom, and then Kazakhstan is planning for three nuclear power plants with several reactors from Rosatom and also from the Chinese state company. So the Kazakhs are constructing the first one on near Lake Balkhash. And so the nuclear power plants definitely have a demand on water. I think there the question is not so much water use, because they pump it through the pump it through the plant and then it's released again. So people who live in New York, there was a big debate over the plant that was up the Hudson River that was cycling water through. So I think the questions on nuclear energy aren't so much about water consumption so much as water quality, which is also something that would be affected by climate change. And another of the plants, I believe they're looking at putting it on the coast of the Caspian Sea, and there you have the water level of the climbing Caspian Sea. So I wouldn't say they're trading one problem for another. I think they're just adding more factors. And there's been a lot of attention on nuclear, but the Kyrgyz were just making announcements, and the Kazakhs have too. They're also adding coal plants, so which have which say what you will about nuclear, but a coal plant, it's hard to come up with, which also I believe use water in that process, though not as much as nuclear. Not sure about that. I don't want to get out of my too much out of my range, but yeah, lots of questions about nuclear, and hopefully they will get resolved.
I want to discuss with you more the Rogan Dam in Tajikistan. And you did touch a little bit on it before, but the Rogan Dam in Tajikistan could become the world's tallest dam. And so I want to hear from you. Do you think it's a solution to the energy problem that the region is going through, or it's more a threat to the downstream water countries?
Well, I won't pronounce my personal opinion on the Rogun Dam, which is perhaps the most the touchiest subject in the entire country of Tajikistan. But certainly the arguments in favor of Rogun are that it could alleviate Tajikistan's energy woes. Because, well, currently there are actually electricity, or earlier at least, there were electricity restrictions in Dushanbe due to the low level of water in the Nurek reservoir, which is currently this huge reservoir in Tajikistan. They get most of their power from hydroelectricity, which mostly comes from Nurek right now. And Nurek actually used to be the tallest dam in the world until the Chinese built a taller one, and now Tajikistan is trying to retake that title. But that project has been ongoing for a very long time. It was fiercely opposed by Islam Karimov. So then Shavkat Mirziyoyev, the current president, that project, the Rogun Dam, which is in the Tajik mountains, and it would affect the stream on the Amu Darya, which is the river we've mostly been talking about. For a long time, that's been controversial. The Uzbeks opposed it because they were worried that it would give the Tajiks so much water storage ability, it would allow them to hold back so much of the river, they could basically keep water hostage, or that they could totally cut off water during the summer, just run it all in the winter to get lots and lots of money from the hydroelectricity. So those were the Uzbek concerns. Then Shavkat Mirziyoyev came to power, and he took a much more constructive approach to this dam. But so they might buy power. Now the issue with that dam is the financing. So the World Bank said that they were going to contribute to it. Then that's been going back and forth. It's been reviewed, so it's all up in the air. But the cons are definitely that if the Tajiks ran the water all in the winter or stored it up, it could deprive the downstream countries, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, of a lot of water. On the other hand, supporters of this dam would say, well, number one, it will solve all of Tajikistan's electricity problems, and they'll be able to get foreign currency by exporting this power to Afghanistan and maybe even Uzbekistan if they're up for it, and there's some agreements in that direction. But the other thing is, with two dam systems on the same river, in theory, if this were run collaboratively, it's almost the perfect example of the prisoner's dilemma, because they can, if they choose not to maximize the amount of water that they run, they can run the upper reservoir, they can drain the upper reservoir during the winter and keep a lot of water in the downstream reservoir. I know that's confusing, for the summer. So a second reservoir, technically, some would argue, supporters of this program would argue, would allow Tajikistan to run more water in the winter, but still save it up, not release it into Uzbekistan until they need it in the summer. But that would require a lot of collaboration, and it would also require Tajikistan to say, we could get more from this, but we're not gonna get as much power as we could during the winter in order to help Uzbekistan. So they would have to not maximize their own gain for the betterment of the entire region. So that always takes some balancing.
Right.
So yes, that was a lot. I hope that was
No,
some
that's
there.
definitely helpful. I understand it's definitely complex, given the politics and the power and the geography of over this water. But no, this is definitely helpful. So the report cites a study showing that if the Rogan is managed comparatively, it could be a win-win situation. But if managed unilaterally, it could drop irrigation by 31%. Thinking about the S7 framework, thinking about all these political and geopolitical factors going on in the region, are you positive that there might be chances of a genuine cooperation on that dam?
Well, so I would, so again, without my personal opinion in it, I would say that there have been moves towards collaboration on the dam. Uzbekistan has open channels, Rakhmon and Mirziyoyev, they meet together. They talk about water all the time. So I think there is definitely collaboration already, and that the two countries are moving in that direction. But it's different from the Kyrgyz projects, where they've agreed to this three-way planning and financing, because Tajikistan really wants that dam to be 100% Tajik. So the answer to that question really rests with the Tajiks, whether they decide that they want to go all in on collaboration. But I think the other question there is, does this dam get built to full height? Because financing remains a question. So if it does get built, it'll be a question for the Tajiks, and I think the Uzbeks are definitely reaching out. But it remains to be seen. There are a lot of unknowns with the Rogun Dam. We've been talking about it for people in Central Asia have been talking about it for, I think they restarted construction sometime in the mid-aughts. I'm not totally sure about that, but this has been a long and winding road towards Rogun, and there's still a lot of distance yet to go.
I want to talk about, we talk about a lot about cooperation and genuine cooperation between these economies. And we know that we have existing water agreements in the region. We have existing regional water agreements. We have the IFAS, we have the Almaty agreements. I guess I have two questions here. Why did this agreement did not really work in kind of build this genuine cooperation on water issues? And the other question is, if those agreements did not work and why they did not work, the reports recommends building this a unified water management organization that is really modeled on the Danube Commission. What would that organization looks like, and how are we going to be overcoming the challenges that we faced at the beginning when we were preparing for those agreements?
So on the first bit, why did the early agreements, like the Almaty agreement, the Almaty Treaty and the Sirdarya agreements, those fell apart because of the energy water exchange. The downstream countries were supposed to send energy in the winter, and then the upstream countries were supposed to release the water in the summer. And that takes a lot of trust, and there were all these questions about, oh, was Kyrgyzstan paying for the low price of gas that Uzbekistan sent them, and they cut the gas off, and then Kyrgyzstan would release a bunch of water and wreck the harvest in some cases. So it fell apart because it was just very hard to maintain that trust that, oh, if I send you gas and oil energy now, you're going to save up the water for me. I mean, that requires an immense amount of trust.
Right.
These are really high stakes things. I mean, energy blackouts were part of the reason, probably one of the factors in the Kyrgyz revolution of 2010. Agriculture is hugely important in Uzbekistan. These are very sensitive reasons. At the same time, the second thing I'd say on that, why did it collapse point, you know, as I said, I spoke to one of the officials at the Interstate Commission, and it's never fully collapsed. They have made, between 1991 and 2015, more than 40 ad hoc agreements were signed, and oftentimes those were in part coordinated by the Interstate Commission. So I don't want to totally, you know, say, oh, these organizations have been a total failure, because they haven't. I mean, even when tensions were high, they were still able to get these countries at the table. Were they ideal agreements? Were they very predictable agreements? No, but the men and women at the international organizations have done just amazing work, especially in some very tense, delicate situations. So even when things were at their worst, these countries were, because like we talked about, they have to get together, and it was often the international organizations that were at least providing the platform and the data to do that. But to move on to the second point about the Danube Commission, I spoke to a professor at the UNESCO's Delft Institute of Water Education, and she, Geneva Sering, she pointed to the Danube Commission as a good example of cooperation, and that organization does great work, and the Danube certainly faces its own problems. Whether we get to those models is a question, but I think, as I've said before, we've seen a huge increase in collaboration. Whether the next harder steps can be made by these countries is yet to be seen, and hopefully they keep moving in the same direction. But yes, I think a Danube-style commission would be is definitely something that experts cite as a great example. So that would definitely help solve the problems in a more lasting way. And the countries, as I said, are moving in the right direction.
And then when we're talking about like how these economies are really kind of trying to work together, and like still some of the agreements are really working, and instead of, you know, saying that they're all collapsing, what do you think the United States, the European Union, and other international Western actors can do to help these economies to continue these existing agreements and cooperation? Do you think, is it a matter of money, technology, diplomatic pressure, or all of the three together?
Well, it's always a matter of money, but
Yeah.
The United States and the European Union, well, first I would say that many of the member states of the European Union, the Germans, the Czechs, especially the Finns, and the Dutch as well, a lot of their national level aid organizations are the ones doing a lot of this work. The German development organization has done tons of this coordination work. The Finns produce these great reports. So doing more of that could always help. At the end of the day, it's going to be the countries themselves that are going to have to say, we want to do more collaboration. But what I would say from the US and the European Union, I was on a glacier with some glaciologists last August, and they talked a lot about how the monitoring stations, both in the mountains and along the rivers, have really crumbled after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the countries themselves are starting to rebuild that. Universities are starting to rebuild that, but science is definitely, and science collaboration are definitely one place that the European Union and the United States and other countries could absolutely help. Rebuilding monitoring systems, helping get better data. You'll see in almost every scientific study of the region in the limitations and concern sections, they say, well, in Central Asia, the data is a little rough. So science could be a huge area where these countries could help out, and financing for collaborative efforts and moving things forward from a diplomatic angle could definitely be helpful. I don't think pushing anybody on this issue would be a great idea, but definitely diplomatic assistance and scientific assistance could be areas where Europe and the United States are already doing a lot and could do more. So.
And then I want to ask you something very important here on that point. The report recommends engaging Afghanistan on a shared water framework. This is something we've read in the report. Given everything we know about Taliban and their track record, how realistic is that recommendation to actually be executed on the ground?
The existing treaties between Afghanistan and the region are Soviet treaties that carry over. And even then, actual observance of those treaties is practically non-existent. I am not an expert in the Taliban or Afghanistan, but I would say that we've seen considerable diplomatic warming between, especially Uzbekistan, to some extent Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and all three of those countries have big projects that they want to cooperate. You've got the power lines, train routes that they all want to work with Afghanistan, and you've seen collaboration really increase between those countries, but none of them recognize the Taliban government officially. Although Russia's recognition may begin to maybe move that, but because of real reticence in the region about Islamic radicalism, there are a lot of factors. So collaboration is definitely increasing between the Taliban and these countries. Turkmenistan's former president, Berdimuhamedov, actually was the first state leader to visit the Taliban in Afghanistan. He drove himself over the border to look at a joint project. So there's definitely collaboration, except in the case of Tajikistan, where things are always touch and go, and relations are very, very, very complex between those two countries. But the other four countries, I think you could definitely see some latitude for some sort of framework or agreement.
Right. And to wrap up this very interesting, very informative conversation we had today, the report mentioned a September 2025 agreement between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan on the Togdugul Reservoir. Is that a model? Do you think this is a good model for broader cooperation? And what do you take on that model? What's your take on that model?
Experts and diplomats say that joint management model, where infrastructure is in one country, but it's managed by everybody who it affects, is a great model, and we've seen that with Cambarata, and we've seen this last year as a really great example of cooperation in the region. During the summer, it was one of the driest years on record in recent times. During the summer, Uzbekistan released water to Kazakhstan to help them. And then in the winter, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan helped Kyrgyzstan by shipping in more energy. They signed an agreement. So that agreement over Cambarata is definitely a great example. And this year was also a good example of where collaboration is heading in the region, and offered some positive signs on this issue.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for this wonderful interview today. Thank you so much for sharing your comments, your insights, and your reflections on the region and the report.
Yes, I hope everyone gets a chance to read it, and thanks so much for talking with me.